So welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Dr. Jeff Soloway. I'm the founder and Chief Trading Officer at MindWell-U. I'm delighted today to welcome Dr. Shauna Shapiro as our special guest to help talk about what you practice grows stronger, the power of mindfulness and compassion. Delighted to have Dr. Shapiro join us today and share so much of, she's got such a rich past in history working within the field, so we're super fortunate to have her today. Before we get into the webinar, I just want to go through a few little housekeeping items. One is that we are going to be sending you a follow-up email in the coming days with a recording of the session. So in case you can't stay for the whole time, or maybe you know a colleague that wanted to see it, we're going to be sending you a recording of this, so you'll have that. We're also going to be showing a few pop-up polls that will come throughout the presentation. And if you can take a moment to just complete that poll, that would be great. This is an example of one. Have you taken the 30-day mindfulness challenge? 30-day mindfulness challenge is our online training of MindWell-U. We've had 30,000 people go through this training with a lot of success. MindWell-U offers online and in-person organizational development solutions for companies, schools, and universities. And if you haven't taken this training, then we'll also send you a link. That might be something you'd like to do. If you work in an organization and you're curious about implementing some form of mindfulness training, we'd also be delighted to talk to you about that. So that's an example of a poll as well. We're going to have, we invite you to have questions. If you have any questions that pop up for you throughout the webinar, please put them into the chat. I'm going to do my best to integrate them into our conversation between Shauna and I, or I'll put them towards the end. So you can put a question into the field, into the chat field, and I'm going to do my best. I think that's all I had to say in order to get us started. Once again, I'm going to introduce our esteemed guest here, Dr. Shauna Shapiro. I definitely read a lot of her articles when I was studying and getting into the field of mindfulness. And I recently met Shauna in person at an event in Ottawa at an event for leaders in the government. So I was really excited to watch her talk there and really inspired by not only, her whole delivery. And so I was really delighted that Shauna was willing to come and share with us here at MindWell-U. So welcome, Shauna. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm delighted to be here.
I didn't really go much into your past. I didn't give everybody a bio about you're a professor, you're a researcher, you work with governments and organizations around the world. Do you want to give us a little bit of a background into the work you've been doing in this area?
Yeah, thank you for that bio. I actually do think it's important, especially when we're talking about mindfulness and meditation, to understand kind of the science and the research and the years that have been kind of behind it. And so I've been a professor for the past 15 years. I've been studying and researching mindfulness for about 20 years. And I think what's been so exciting for me as I've kind of developed in this field, it really has grown, is seeing how the research is really deepening my understanding of meditation. And so I had my own kind of personal experience, but as we start to see the results of the research and we start to be able to kind of use them to blend together with our personal experience, I think we're able to reach a lot more people and in much more effective ways.
And, maybe it's a good place to start off just at the basic level of, how do you come to understand mindfulness? And perhaps I'll even ask you to distinguish between mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah, that's actually a really good place to start. Is the difference between mindfulness and meditation is that mindfulness is really a way of being. It's a way of living our moment-to-moment lives. So right now, hopefully people are mindfully listening. meditation is a way to develop and strengthen mindfulness, just like going to a gym. We'd go to a gym and we'd lift weights, not so much to go to the gym and lift weights, but so that I can make my biceps strong so I can go home and pick up my son. And so part of mindfulness is the practice of meditation. However, there's many ways to practice mindfulness. And I like to use a very simple definition of mindfulness. It's paying attention in a kind and curious way, intentionally, so on purpose. And so there's these three core elements. There's the intention, which is just knowing, why am I paying attention? Your attention, which is simply bringing your attention into the present moment. And then your attitude, which is this kind, curious attitude. So we could even try it for a minute right now, if that's okay. Yeah.
I think we should. Yeah. We often try and integrate some practice into our webinars because a lot of these people have been engaged with some form of mindfulness.
Yeah. So whether or not you've practiced before, just take a moment and you can let your eyes close or just look down at the floor in front of you. And we begin, just like I mentioned, with our intention. So just reflecting on why you might want to practice mindfulness, maybe to cultivate more ease and peace in your life. Maybe it's to become more patient as a mother or father. I know that's one for me. Maybe it's just to be curious and open. So whatever your intention is, I just want you to find it. And then begin to gather your attention into the present moment. So see if you can just feel your feet, wiggle your toes. See if you can feel your seat in the chair. See if you can just soften your face, really let your jaw unhinge and release. And then just bringing your attention to your breath. Notice that you're breathing all by yourself. You don't have to think about it or control it. And just feel the breath as it naturally flows in and out of the body. And see if you can bring the attitude of kindness and curiosity to whatever's happening. So probably you've noticed your mind has wandered. Can you bring it back with kindness? Can you be curious about what your experience is? Right now, are you tired, hungry, cold, warm, excited, nervous, bored? See if you can actually be interested. And we'll just sit here for 3 more breaths, practicing our intention, attention, and attitude. And on this last breath, as you exhale, just letting some light come back in through the eyes. You can go ahead and stretch your arms above your head or just move your body in any way that feels good. Good. So that's just a basic introduction to mindfulness. And what I find helpful is just to have these 3 elements to really anchor people of what's your intention, your attention, and then your attitude.
Thank you, Shauna. I know that everybody who's tuning in, whether they're at work or at home, they appreciate just a moment to pause and to even help to put aside some of the other tasks that they might have been doing, the busyness from the morning, and just to come fully present, to be able to listen and be with us more fully for today's webinar. You talked about attitude. I wonder if you can dive a little bit deeper into that. How did you learn about the importance of attitude and the importance of kindness and compassion?
Yeah. So when I was first learning about mindfulness, I went to Thailand and I ended up at a monastery there to do a meditation retreat. And I didn't know much about mindfulness, but I kind of knew it was about paying attention in the present moment. So I really focused my attention, and the monks didn't speak much English, but I kind of understood I was supposed to focus on my breath, and that's how I trained my attention. So I began, 1 breath, 2 breaths, and just like you might have noticed, or everyone out there, my mind wandered. It's what the mind does. But I kept getting frustrated and kind of judgmental, and why can't I do this? And I started trying harder, and it just wasn't working. And at a certain point, I just, I felt like I was a fake. I felt like, what am I doing here? I'm not really spiritual, and started judging myself. And then I started judging everyone around me, even the monks. Why are they just sitting here? Should they be doing something? And luckily, a monk from England arrived who spoke English. And as I shared with him my struggles, he looked at me and he said, "Oh, dear, you're not practicing mindfulness. You're practicing judgment, impatience, frustration." And then he said 5 words that I've never forgotten. "What you practice grows stronger." And he explained to me that if I was practicing mindfulness with judgment, I was just growing judgment. If I was practicing with frustration, I was just growing frustration. So he helped me understand that mindfulness isn't just about attention. It's about how we pay attention. He said it's like these loving arms that embrace whatever arises. And so I refer to this as the attitude, this attitude of kindness, of curiosity, where you're kind of like your own best parent or your own best friend. And you're like, "Oh, sweetheart, tell me about that. I care." And what I've learned, what's interesting is when I came back to the West and I went through my PhD program and was really trying to create a model of mindfulness. My very first book chapter with Dr. Gary Schwartz, I wrote this model of intention, attention, attitude. And I remember so clearly because the editors wrote back and they said, "It's a great model, wonderful intention, attention, but just drop that last part, the attitude. Like all that kindness and that compassion." They're like, "No, we don't really need that." And what I've come to learn is that is the most important part of mindfulness, is this kind, curious attitude. And I kind of want to explain the science behind it, if that's okay, because it's not just to be nice. I wouldn't tell you, "Oh, it's the most important part because I just want you to be nice." It's actually important from a physiological standpoint. When we are judging ourselves or criticizing ourselves or in this kind of shaming mentality, what happens is the learning centers of the brain shut down. And it actually shuttles all of our resources to survival pathways. What kindness does, what compassion does, what curiosity does, is they turn on the learning centers of the brain because they bathe our system in dopamine. So they actually give us the resources we need to change. So what mindfulness does is, by bringing this kind, curious attitude, we can actually see parts of our lives that are not working, see parts of ourselves that are not working, and have the courage and the kindness and compassion to actually make changes to lead to greater happiness and health. So that's why I feel like it's been my fight in the academic world to get this attitude to be accepted as not just legitimate, but essential. And in fact, the United Kingdom Parliament, they just came out with a whole report on mindfulness where they spent 2 years with all the top researchers. And their definition of mindfulness says, paying attention in the present moment with an attitude of kindness and curiosity. So I felt like my work is done.
Well, thank you so much for that in-depth explanation. And to follow up, I'm curious to hear a little bit about what you think. We have seen a number of different trainings focusing around compassion and self-compassion becoming more popular these days. Do you see this in close relationship to what you're talking about here, or what are some distinctions or similarities that you can draw?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Kristen Neff is one of the pioneers of this work in self-compassion, and she's one of my dearest friends and colleagues. And so here's how I like to think about it. So mindfulness is kind of the big umbrella. And mindfulness is about our moment-to-moment attention, where we bring this kind, curious attitude. Okay, so I can be mindful of eating a delicious meal. I don't necessarily need self-compassion while I'm eating a delicious meal, unless I ate too much and then I feel sick, and then I can bring in my self-compassion. But mindfulness is kind of like how you just approach your daily life. Now, when mindfulness meets suffering, right, and you become aware that you're suffering, then it shifts into self-compassion, where typically when we're suffering, either because of something in life that's happened to us or because we've made a mistake and we've hurt ourselves or someone else, our typical response isn't self-compassion. our typical response is to beat ourselves up, judge ourselves, feel like, God, if only I'd done this, or I should have done this. Instead of saying, oh, sweetheart, ouch, that hurt. And so what mindfulness does is helps us recognize we're in pain. And then self-compassion comes in with this care and this support. The three elements of self-compassion. So mindfulness has three elements. Self-compassion has three elements. The three elements of self-compassion are mindfulness, the first element. The second element is this kind of caring, kind support. The third element is called common humanity. And I love this. Kristen developed this dimension of it, and I really appreciate it, because when we're suffering, often we feel completely isolated and alone in our suffering. It's like, I'm the only one who's getting divorced, or I'm the only one who, is feeling lonely. And what common humanity does is it helps you recognize that you're not alone in your suffering, that there's probably millions of people who are experiencing the same thing. And so it helps us connect with a larger whole and not feel kind of singled out. And also begin to offer our compassion, not just for ourselves, but for others. So, for example, I was recently working with a woman with breast cancer, and we were practicing the self-compassion, and we were going into the mindfulness of feeling her fear and her anger and her, and really her grief. And then going into bringing some kindness and support for herself, sweetheart, this is hard. But then going into common humanity and saying, how many other women have breast cancer right now and are facing this surgery and treatment? And can we send the same love and support to them so that there's this sense of being part of something bigger?
Moving outside of oneself.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the keys to these practices that we sometimes miss. You had mentioned about how do we bring this into corporations, which I believe is really important. And a lot of the work I'm doing is around leadership. And but if we are only doing it for ourselves, I think these practices lose some of their power and actually lose some of the heart from which they come. These practices aren't just about making ourselves happier. They're really grounded in interconnection and interdependence and an understanding that none of us are separate. And so when we practice, we're practicing not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
Well, maybe that's a nice lead-in into a question around the implications for the workplace. You were talking about, you can approach that from a number of different levels, mindfulness, the attitude, but, maybe you can talk a little bit further about the implications for the workplace.
Yeah, it's interesting. So my work for most of my career was in working with women with breast cancer, working with physicians, nurses, really in the health field. And I was invited to speak in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen Business School, and then at another kind of leadership and mindfulness conference about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was the first entree into mindfulness in the workplace. And I was a little skeptical and hesitant at first. And what I would say is that I've been so impressed and have such deep respect for this new movement. I think it's incredibly important for a number of reasons. So there's a few applications. One is, as we've learned in 20 years of research, is mindfulness is good for us, right? It helps us sleep better. It improves our immune functioning. It reduces stress and cortisol. It improves happiness and sense of, meaning. So just as a way to take care of people in the workplace, I think it's really effective. And yet it goes way beyond that. So a lot of the people that approach me are kind of human resources, and then they say, come in, we want to do a stress management. And what I try to explain to them is, yes, this will help with stress management, absolutely. And I just want to let you guys know about these other benefits. And so I've been doing a bit of research into those. So not only does mindfulness help us in terms of well-being, it increases our creativity, our innovation, our problem solving. We just finished a study at Stanford University demonstrating that in engineering PhD students, that mindfulness is significantly related to innovation and creativity. And what was most exciting in the study is that the attitude of mindfulness was the strongest predictor. So what I like to tell people in the fields of in the workplace and in leadership is that, yes, mindfulness will help us take care of ourselves and our employees. It'll make us happier, but it also gives you the skills you need in the workforce. Beyond creativity and innovation, it also has significant implications for interpersonal relationship, for empathy, for compassion, for communication. You know, so much cost in the workplace is around, interpersonal difficulties and also not having strong company loyalty. So I live in the Bay Area, and in these biotech and tech industries, the turnover rates are staggering. So what we found is that when you do a mindfulness training, it increases the sense of loyalty and connection and fidelity to the workplace, which is going to save tons of money and make people happier.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you're talking about the core element of mindfulness being this interrelatedness, and then talking about teams and working with teams. And you're not just doing it for yourself, but you're also doing it for some relatedness, and now talking about loyalty and empathy with the people that you work with, because there's so much, a lot of people work in teams in organizations, and a lot of conflict arises in teams and in the workplace. And so much of it is learning to work with conflict. Conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. It often helps us reach new levels of insight and innovation if we can approach it with the right mindset, with the right attitude.
And mindfulness really is a mindset of this intention, attention, attitudes. The intention for the team is to collaborate and work towards a shared vision, and we're all focusing our attention here, and then we're doing it with curiosity and kindness, so that if we have a difference of opinion, it's like, tell me more, I'm curious, right? I see it differently.
So in some of your earlier research, you did studies around therapists and working with in clinical situations, and maybe the therapeutic relationship. I'm wondering, so the presence of the practitioner working with another person, are there some parallels that, not necessarily you've done studies on it, but do you see some parallels in the workplace?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why this transition over to bringing mindfulness into the workplace has been so seamless, is that what we've been studying and researching and training clinicians, physicians, nurses, anyone in the helping profession, is how to relate to another person, how to communicate clearly. And this is what needs to happen in the workplace in terms of, from top management to team building. And so these skills, they really support us in, one, knowing our own values, and then two, being respectful and honoring and empathic with other people. And, one of the areas I'm really interested in is in terms of kind of cultural awareness and awareness of biases in terms of gender, race, ethnicity. And one of the things that mindfulness has been shown to do in the laboratory at UC Berkeley is it reduces our own race bias, where we kind of have trouble seeing other people that are outside of our race and respecting them clearly. And I think that's a really important area for our world right now, is starting to see our interconnection with all people, and not necessarily that we're all the same. I think differences are really important, but that we're connected. And so I think this is one of the areas I'm most excited about and want to support.
Interesting. I wonder, we try and integrate some strategies or some suggestions for people on our who are listening in. Are there anything that comes to mind around a strategy or a practice for cultivating compassion and kindness in the workplace?
I have a million. This is what I do. So a couple of things. One of the first places to begin is what your intention is. Our intentions really set the stage for what is possible. They guide us. Jack Kornfield says, your intention sets the compass of your heart. It says, this is the direction I want to go. So when I'm working with my patients or my clients, we always begin with intention, and we get it really clear, where we write it down, and And it's not that your intention doesn't evolve, because it does as you change, but it's important to have kind of a direction. This isn't a destination. It's not a goal. It's just, it's your compass. And what I do is every morning I connect with my intention, so that instead of just being on automatic pilot mode and heading off to work, and that I actually pause and just reflect on, why am I doing this? Why am I here? Even before I teach my classes at the university, right before class, I'll just close my eyes and just pause, like, what's my intention? And usually it's just, may this be a benefit. You know, it doesn't have to be that specific. But it helps reorient me, because otherwise I'm just going about my day and I forget, why am I actually here? I'll tell a short story about intention that will help illustrate it. So this was a couple years ago, and I was away from my son for 2 weeks. I was teaching in Europe, and it was the longest we'd ever been apart. And as I was flying back from Europe, you know, I'd missed him terribly, and I started getting really anxious, like, oh my God, I've been away from him for too long, and have I ruined our connection? And instead of kind of spiraling into this bottomless pit of shame, which as parents, we all know we're never good enough, I set a really clear intention. When I get home, the first 24 hours, I'm not going to unpack, check mail, email. I'm just going to spend it with Jackson. So I arrived home. It was a beautiful day, and we live near the beach. We both love the ocean. So I said, hey, Jackson, you want to go to the beach today? And he said, sure. So I start packing up his favorite foods for a picnic and getting all our beach gear. And I'm out at the car. I'm waving to the neighbors like, look, I'm home. See what a good mom I am. And it's not going to end well. So I go back inside. I'm like, hey, Jackson, you ready? And he's like, nah, I don't feel like going anymore. I was like, what? We're going to go to the beach, and I'm going to show you how much I love you. Damn it. So he gets on his swim trunks, and we're walking out of the house, and I'm at the car, and I look back, and he's just sitting on our front porch. And I'm like, hey, Jackson, let's go. He doesn't even look up. And I notice I start getting impatient and a little bit frustrated, because I'm on my agenda, right? I want to get to the beach in time for the perfect picnic in the sunlight. And then luckily, I remembered my intention. What's the most important thing? Right? It's just to reconnect with my son, just to let him know, like, mom's home and you're safe and I love you. So I walked back over where he's sitting, and I sat down next to him, and we're kind of sitting there, and he was actually watching these ants. So I sit down and watch the ants for a couple minutes, and all of a sudden I notice his little body begin to soften, and his shoulder kind of leans into my shoulder. I feel the sun on our backs. And that was it. That was the most important thing. But we forget. So our intention helps remind us, helps keep us connected with what we actually value. The second thing that I invite people to do in terms of practice is, I really do believe in meditation practice. If someone wants to learn how to play tennis, I always say, go practice, right? What you practice grows stronger. We know this with neuroplasticity. Whatever our repeated, behaviors, thoughts, actions, they strengthen the neural pathways in our brain. So if I want to be able to remember my intention and remember what's important to me, like being a mother, I need to practice. And so I encourage people to start a mindfulness practice that's very simple and very short. So I say 1 minute a day. You have your 30-day challenge. I say 1 minute a day for 30 days. No matter what happens, pause and set your intention, attention, and attitude, just to kind of create that pathway that you're continuing to grow. So setting an intention, and then making sure that you have at least 1 minute of the day where you stop everything and you reconnect.
Beautiful. Beautiful. That's one of the goals of the 30-day challenge, is to help people develop this practice of Take 5. That's our mindfulness practice. We call it Take 5, and it's got 5 steps to it. And it's really a practice of noticing, just like what you're saying, noticing our intention, our attention, our body, our breath, our mindset, our attitude, and for people to help develop this ability to guide themselves through this practice. So it's not something that they need to become reliant on, putting on their earbuds to listen to a recording, but something that they can do even at work, before a meeting, having a difficult conversation. It's always something that we can access.
Wonderful.
You mentioned a little bit about shame in the parents, your context of being a parent. And I really related to that example that you shared with your son. I think a lot of parents can, trying to create a situation, well, we think it should be, but really all they really need is for us to
be present with them.
where they are, which is difficult. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. It sounds simple, but as we know, mindfulness is simple, but not necessarily easy.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about shame and maybe why it isn't helpful in the learning or change process?
Yeah, it's something I'm really interested in, and the implications for parenting, for education, in the workplace are profound. So it's interesting because when you start to talk about shame versus self-compassion, the first thing that comes up for people is, well, if I'm kind to myself, if I'm compassionate to myself, then I'm going to lose all my motivation, then I'm going to keep making these mistakes, then I'm going to, become indulgent and just sit on the couch and eat Oreos all day. And like, there's a lot of fear and resistance to compassion. And people think that this kind of constant self-judgment or shame is somehow going to help them improve, right? And so what I'm trying to help people do with the science is to see that this is wrong, that shame doesn't work, that physiologically it can't work to help us learn these new behaviors. And that what the research in self-compassion is showing is that self-compassion actually increases our motivation. It increases our health caretaking behaviors, right? If you care for yourself, then you're probably not going to drink and overeat, and you're probably going to exercise and go to your doctor's appointments. They've shown that self-compassion is one of the most effective ways to get people to change. They did a really interesting study with people who are trying to lose weight. And half the group had instructions that said, it's really important that you not eat this fat and these calories because it can lead to death and illness, and kind of used fear and judgment. And the other category, they said, everyone occasionally overeats, it's okay, but do your best because you care about yourself and it leads to health. And the self-compassion condition lost more weight, felt much happier about themselves. And it's so counterintuitive because, and I know for myself, it's like, I think I have to kind of beat myself up and push to get things done in my life. But we don't. And the key to self-compassion is not this kind of soft, floppy, just whatever. It's the mindfulness is part of it. So there's this precision and this laser-like attention and the kindness. And it's that combination that I think is really unstoppable. And I think people in the workplace are starting to see that. They're starting to recognize, oh, I can motivate people much better through kindness than through fear. I mean, if shame and judgment worked, I tell people, I'm like, well, fine, go ahead and do it. If it worked, beat yourself up. If it's going to make you a better person, like, go for it. But it doesn't even work.
You mentioned seeing it go into the workplace, and I just wonder, like, we've seen such a big movement into that. It started more in medicine and healthcare and clinical populations, and we've seen it move into education. Both, we have a large population in Canada, where MindWell-U does most of its work, but also in the US, we see it in governments, and move it into the workplace. I'd say we're seeing a big movement in the last 5 to 10 years. What do you see as important ingredients, strategies for integrating mindfulness in the workplace?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I think it's really helpful to have the science to legitimize it. And, what I've found is how you frame mindfulness and compassion is really important. And then if I go in with my kind of new agey meditation stuff, that's usually not the best strategy. So I think really coming from a scientific lens. I also think it's important to maintain the integrity of the practices, even while we try to simplify them and adjust them and make them culturally relevant to the West. And so I think what I've been trying to focus on is how can we decontextualize it from its kind of Buddhist roots so that it's applicable to everyone, without losing the essence of mindfulness. And for me, one of the pieces of mindfulness that often gets lost is kind of this understanding of interconnection and interdependence, and this understanding around kind of ethical code and ethical conduct. You know, these practices weren't developed so that you could hone your attention and become the best sniper in the world. And they are being used in the military. And I think I'm actually feel good about that, because I know Amishi Jha, one of the lead researchers, is really committed to bringing all the dimensions of mindfulness. So yes, it's going to improve their attentional skills. It'll also improve their compassion and their ability to kind of recover from the trauma of being in war. So I think for me, the key ingredients are to really make sure to bring some rigor to how we bring mindfulness into the workplace, and to really not forgetting about the compassion piece and the interdependence piece and the cause and effect piece of ethics. You know, one of the research studies I recently did was with college freshmen, looking at ethical decision making and ethical behavior, and showing how mindfulness can increase our ethical decision making. And so I think if we bring mindfulness with its kind of depth and wisdom into the workplace, it's going to really support people in living in alignment with their values. At least that's my hope.
And if you're introducing it into the workplace, you know, the context is pretty different. You know, I think what we used to see was people offering maybe mindfulness-based trainings for clinical groups or smaller groups, people who might be coming to you, they're interested to take this training. They're putting their hand up, putting themselves in a room where they're going into this type of an approach, and move into a place where now they're teaching it in schools, to these populations, or maybe in the workplace where it's more freely available. So I guess I'm trying to ask you about, you know, the developmental spectrum of people learning mindfulness. You know, do you see, you know, different steps for people learning mindfulness? Do we need to give them all of mindfulness right at the beginning?
Yeah,
so that full integrity, or, you know, are there small kernels that we can provide people at the beginning to help give them some benefit, because maybe they're not ready for a full meal right now?
I think that's a really important point, and absolutely. In fact, I think there's a way to do both. I think there's a way to do both, where you can distill mindfulness down to its essence and make it completely simple and digestible, without kind of denying some of the more important pieces. So for me, I always bring in intention, attention, attitude. And for me, those three actually, they fulfill the whole entire, you know, scope of mindfulness. Now you can go very deep into each one of them, but even if you just start at the basic level, I think they cover the dimensions of what mindfulness is about. And I also think how you language things and making it more appropriate in the workplace versus, you know, for school children versus for, you know, at the cancer center, it's a different languaging, but really we're all human beings, right? All of us are stressed. All of us feel scared. All of us just want to feel safe and connected. You know, it's relatively basic, and often we feel really alone in all these experiences. So one of the things that's helpful when you teach this in groups is people start to hear, oh, you feel that way too. Or, oh, your mind wanders all the time too. Or, you know, you judge yourself constantly. And this sense of common humanity is profound. It's a big part of it.
There's a part to this around culture, and, you know, a lot of the work that we're doing now with MindWell is around shifting culture in an organization, and we've got a question, a related question from one of our audience members right now about culture. So I'm gonna read the question. It's not necessarily a question about organizational culture, but I'm starting with that type of context. This is more about our Western culture. Why do you think our culture, our world culture, or Western culture in general shuns or doesn't focus on mindfulness or its cultural equivalent? Why are we a go, go, go in Western culture? When we're praised, we're praising kind of top achievers. Mm-hmm. Is it our cultural biology and inherence, for a lack of a better world? So,
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure why. That's not what I study. What I study is how do we respond given the truth of what's here? And so I would agree that the focus of our culture has been on this individualistic, go, 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 achievement oriented. And I think what we're recognizing is that that's not bringing happiness and well-being. You know, there's been decades of research now showing that when people win the lottery, you know, their happiness goes up for a moment and then it comes right back down to baseline levels. What we're finding is that materialistic goods, you know, big successes and achievements actually don't lead to long-term happiness. And what does lead to happiness is the sense of belonging and connection, and also these internal changes that we've seen through mindfulness and compassion practice. And so I think we're kind of, in some ways, pivoting our culture to a different way of being that is more connected, that is less individualistic and less goal-oriented. Now, I want to be really clear. You know, you go into workplaces and you say that, and they're like, "Oh, you could leave now." What is so interesting and paradoxical with all of this is that you're more effective. You know, I mean, people are so afraid that mindfulness and compassion are going to make them lose their edge. And what I try to explain is your mind actually works more efficiently and more effectively because you're not wasting so much time on the self-judgment, on the constant criticism, and you're allowing your nervous system to downregulate so you have more resources available to you. And so there's a way to be completely effective and precise and kind. Just like my body can be physiologically at ease and my mind can be laser-like. You know, we used to think that you had to be kind of amped up so that your mind could perform accurately. Western science has completely proven that wrong. It's just inaccurate. So we have a lot of cultural biases and mindsets and ideas that are no longer serving, and they're actually, you know, flat out wrong.
Yeah, and I think we can work towards shifting cultures. I think that's one of our goals. Is when we work with organizations these days, we like to work with the executives right to the front lines and offer different training approaches for people at different levels that are most appropriate for them, but creating a common language or literacy of mindfulness within an organization. And as we go in further depth with these organizations, it also starts to get into the principles, procedures, the strategies of that organization. So it really starts to get deeper in when it starts, so it can take deeper root.
Beautiful.
So thank you for that question around culture. The other thing that it brings to mind for me is when I've thought of that question in the past, it was like, well, where did these practices come from? They came, over 2,500 years ago, developed in a culture which was different from Western culture, and yet there was a need for this practice in these Eastern cultures as well. So it just triggers to me that it's not, this practice isn't just for coming out of a need to work with kind of a Western, more capitalistic culture, but it's more of a human experience that these practices can really support with.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of what's exciting about this time is we're seeing how mindfulness is an innate human capacity, right? Applicable to all of us. And we're also learning about how do we need to shift these practices, and what's most useful and most effective for the West, given our current situation, given the fact that most of us have families and are householders and employed, and what are the kind of key themes that we need to be focusing on, that are going to best support our culture, that are going to best support our world. And it's really, I think it's really an exciting time. I mean, I think seeing the openness and the curiosity across so many different disciplines and having the science to back it up, we're really in a place where we can be creative and use these teachings and these practices to support people in the workplace and education and healthcare, in our parenting and our homes. So be engaged.
It is an exciting time, and I'm going to come back to you and I'll ask you the question now, and then I'm going to do a little closing, and then I'll give you the final word, Shauna. And my question will be around, what you see as next steps. We've seen so much growth in the area of mindfulness over the past 15, 20, 30 years. What do you see as next steps for mindfulness? But before I give it to you, I want to just thank everyone for tuning in to today's session. And I don't think we were disappointed in the slightest with our conversation today with Dr. Shauna Shapiro. It was amazing to have such an expert talk to us so clearly and concisely about mindfulness and practices and implications in the workplace. I want to remind everybody that we'll send you a recording of this. So it's an opportunity to share it with a few key colleagues who might be interested. Maybe you're in a workplace where you're curious about bringing mindfulness into your workplace, and that's something that we can support you with in terms of finding the right step for you. Also want to let you know we have some really exciting upcoming webinars, the end of this month, October 24th, with Dr. Jamie Grumman. He's a professor in the School of Business at Guelph University. Is going to be talking about the role of mindfulness in fostering recovery from work. He's just recently written a book on boosting. And in November, we're having Dr. Chris Bell. He's associate professor at the Schulich School of Business at York University. He's going to be talking about mindfulness, envy, and relationships in the workplace, which should be interesting. So you'll be able to sign up for those in your chat window right now. Back to you, Shauna. What comes to mind next steps in the world of mindfulness?
I'd say there's two. I think the first one is really continuing to bring self-compassion and kindness into the culture of mindfulness and into the teaching and study of it. I think that's an element that we can't lose. And then I think the second theme that is really important is to help our understanding of interdependence, and to really understand that this isn't some like spiritual thing, that this is, the foundation of physics and systems theory and cybernetics and ecology. And I think all of the issues we're facing right now in the world need that understanding to help face them and solve them. So I'd say those are the two. And I just want to thank you so much for inviting me, and happy to have shared this conversation with all of you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shauna, so much. Wishing everyone a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.